This is my true story. I spent my life raising my son, working hard so he would never lack anything. I believed family dinners were where respect and love lived. But one evening changed everything. My own son spat on my face 15 times at the dinner table, while his wife laughed and cheered. I felt more than pain. I felt betrayal. That night I sat quietly, thinking of what to do. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I decided on a silent, lasting answer. Before I share what happened next, please tell me where you are watching from and subscribe so my story can reach more people. I spent decades working tirelessly to give my son a life better than mine. From my youth, I knew hard work was not just a way to survive. It was a way to build something lasting for those you love. I began working when I was barely old enough to hold a hammer steadily. I worked mornings, afternoons, and nights. I saved every penny I could, often going without small comforts, just so my son would have enough. My hands became rough with labor, my back bent under weight, but I never complained. I believed my sacrifices would one day be understood. Every brick I laid in the house, every penny put into savings, every meal skipped, it was all for him. I wanted him to know he could stand tall without fear, that he could live without worry. I remember when he was a boy, I told him, "Work hard, be kind, and never forget where you came from." I thought those words were seeds planted for life. I believed they would grow into respect and love. We had dinner together every evening when he was young. I would ask about his day. I would try to laugh with him, to teach him simple lessons. Lessons I learned by living a hard life. But somewhere along the way, those moments started to disappear. The respect I thought I had earned slowly faded. My presence was taken for granted. I gave and gave, expecting nothing but gratitude, yet receiving little in return. I worked extra hours so he could attend school without worry. I gave him what I could not have, thinking that my sacrifice would make him better prepared for the world. My nights were spent in exhaustion, and my mornings were filled with planning his future. Every night, I prayed he would grow up to be a man of honor, a man who would value his family. I thought he would see the home I built as a sacred place, a place of warmth, trust, and safety. I believed respect was the foundation of family life. I thought the house was more than bricks and wood. It was a home, a testament to everything I had worked for. I never wanted riches for myself. I wanted comfort for my son. I thought that when he grew older, he would understand what it meant to give without expecting something in return. I thought he would know that respect was earned through sacrifice and love. My wife and I often talked about how proud we were of him, but somewhere along the way, pride turned to arrogance in him. I began to notice changes in his behavior. He stopped listening. He started questioning everything I said, but I thought it was part of growing up, part of becoming independent. I thought it was a phase. Our family dinners became quieter over time. The laughter that once filled the room was replaced with silence or cold words. I still tried to speak with kindness, to encourage him, but my voice was met with impatience. I began to feel a distance growing between us. I worked harder, hoping my actions would speak louder than words. I believed my love and sacrifices would keep our bond unbroken. I thought that the trust we built over years would never break. I was wrong. I did not know then how deep the disrespect would grow. Even when I was tired, even when my body ached, I never stopped giving. I thought giving was a father's duty. I thought it was my honor. I thought it would create a legacy, not just of wealth, but of love. I believed my son would cherish what I gave him, not for its value in money, but for the love behind it. I imagined him one day looking back and saying, "My father gave everything so I could live better." But the truth was far from what I imagined. My sacrifices became something he saw as weakness. My care became something he mocked quietly. My patience became something he tested. I never expected the night that changed everything, the night he spat on my face 15 times at dinner. That was not just disrespect. That was a breaking point. That was a moment when every year of sacrifice, every hard day, every skipped meal seemed to vanish under a cloud of humiliation. I did not argue. I did not shout. I just sat quietly, feeling something inside me shift. It was not anger alone. It was the realization that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. And if it is taken for granted, the consequences must be felt. That night, my mind wandered through decades of memories. I saw my hands, calloused and strong, building a life. I saw my sacrifices. I saw my patient words. I saw the dinners, the nights worked, the doors opened for him. And I saw him, my son, mocking all of it. I could not understand how love could turn into cruelty. My silence at the table was not weakness. It was the moment of decision. I knew something had to change. I knew the lesson had to be louder than my words. It had to be something unforgettable. I realized the only way to teach my son respect was through action. Not an argument, not a scene, but a quiet act of consequence that he would never forget. I knew it would require patience, planning, and precision. I thought about what would speak louder than words. I thought about justice, not revenge. And then I decided I would use what I had worked for all my life to make the lesson unforgettable. I would use the home I had built for him. I began quietly. I consulted a lawyer in secret. I learned my legal rights. I checked every deed and paper. The house he thought was his by living in it every day belonged to me, in law and in truth. I did not act in anger. I acted in quiet determination. I wanted to show him that cruelty and disrespect have consequences. I wanted to show him that his actions could not go unanswered. I wanted him to understand that respect was not a game to be mocked. I began the process quietly, with no drama. I found a buyer who respected the property. I signed the papers. I arranged everything so that no one could reverse it. I prepared a letter for my son, a letter without hatred, but with the truth. I wanted him to understand what I had done and why. I wanted him to learn without me shouting, without a fight. When the papers were signed, I felt a strange peace. I knew I had taught the lesson without raising my voice. I knew I had shown him that disrespect carries weight, that love is not an endless gift when it is met with cruelty. I left the house quietly, leaving behind the locked door and the dinner table where he spat on my face 15 times. I walked away with dignity and without looking back. That was my decision. That was my answer. My way of teaching him a lesson he could never forget. After years of quiet devotion, the signs of disrespect began slowly, almost unnoticed at first. They came in small ways, words left unspoken, moments ignored, gestures dismissed. My son began to speak sharply to me at home. It was not a single moment of anger, but a change in tone, a shift in respect. He no longer asked my opinion, and when he did, he seemed to answer before I could finish. My words became interruptions, and my advice became noise. I could see the change in his eyes. Where there once was warmth, there was impatience. Where there once was understanding, there was indifference. It began quietly, almost as if I were losing something I did not yet notice. His behavior at home grew colder. My requests for help or conversation were met with sighs. My questions about his day were answered briefly, without eye contact. He stopped sharing meals with me in the way we once had. Instead, he ate in silence, as if my presence were a burden. I tried to remind myself that people change, that children grow and carve their own paths. But deep inside, I knew something different was happening. Respect was fading. His disregard for me grew over months. It was not just in words, it was in his actions. He would ignore my presence in the room. He would pass by without a nod, without even a glance. I began to realize that my sacrifices had been taken as something permanent, something owed without thanks. I had given so much without asking that he no longer saw the value in what I gave. I became, in his mind, just another part of the background. My life's work, my years of labor, were fading into silence. At first I thought this was a phase. I told myself that with time, respect would return. I believed patience could rebuild what was breaking. I reminded myself of the times when he had looked to me for guidance as a boy, the times he had trusted me. But slowly, my patience wore thin. His words became sharper. He began to answer back in ways that were disrespectful. He treated my advice as a joke. He made decisions without speaking to me, as if my voice held no weight. It was as if my years of work meant nothing. The disrespect spread to how he treated my belongings. Things I treasured were handled carelessly. Items I had saved for years, things that carried memories, were tossed aside. Books I had read to him, photographs I had taken of family moments, tools I had used for decades. These were treated with disregard. He mocked the value of these things, laughing when I tried to explain their importance. That laughter felt like a blade through my heart. I tried to speak calmly, to remind him of respect and gratitude, but my words were met with silence or ridicule. The family home, which I had built with my own hands, began to feel like a place where I was unwelcome. My voice was no longer heard at the dinner table. My presence was not considered. Even my wife, who had stood by me for years, seemed to avoid confrontation. The family gatherings became quiet affairs, filled with tension. I began to see that my sacrifices had not created unity, but a wall between us. I felt the loss of what we once had. It was not a single moment, but a slow erosion of respect and love. One evening, I noticed it most clearly. At dinner, there was a sharpness in his tone I could not ignore. He spoke over me, dismissed my words, and mocked my opinion in front of others. I stayed silent, hoping it was just an accident. But over the days that followed, the sharpness turned to disregard, and disregard turned to cruelty. My patience began to feel tested beyond endurance. I began to fear that respect, once lost, might never return, and I knew that something had to be done before the moment of breaking came. I watched him change. The boy who once looked up to me with admiration now looked at me with impatience, even disdain. Respect was gone, replaced by arrogance. He did not care to hide it anymore. At family gatherings, he spoke over me, made jokes at my expense, and treated my words as if they were unworthy of attention. It was not just a matter of disrespect. It was a dismissal of a lifetime of sacrifice. And I knew deep inside that this change was not just about age or independence. It was about how he had learned to value, or rather not value, me and everything I had done. The signs of disrespect had become clear long before the night that changed everything. They were in his tone, in his actions, in the way he treated me as if I were invisible. My home, my life's work, my devotion, these were no longer acknowledged. I tried to speak to him gently, to remind him of the lessons I had given him over the years. But he would turn away, not listening, or worse, smiling as if my words were unimportant. I began to understand that respect, once lost, is not easy to regain. And I knew that a moment of cruelty was coming, and when it did, it would demand a lesson he could never forget. That night came suddenly. It was not just disrespect, it was humiliation in its rawest form. It was the culmination of years of disregard, and it was in that moment, when he spat on my face 15 times at dinner, that I realized patience alone would not correct the cruelty. That night, all the signs of disrespect became a reality. My silence was no longer patience. It was the calm before a decision. The lesson I had been preparing for in my heart was ready to be given. I began to understand that respect is not given freely. It is earned, kept, and protected. And when it is lost through cruelty, it must be reclaimed, not with anger, but with action. That night, I decided my lesson would be quiet, powerful, and irreversible. I decided to let my actions speak louder than any words could. That evening at dinner, the air felt heavier than usual. The room was quiet except for the sound of silverware clinking against plates. I could feel a tension in my son's voice all day. He had been speaking in a sharp tone earlier, brushing past me without a word, and refusing even the smallest courtesies. I tried to ignore it, thinking perhaps fatigue had made him irritable. But something inside told me tonight would not be like other nights. There was a sharpness in his eyes, a coldness in his expression that I had not seen before. Dinner began, as it usually did, with silence and a few polite remarks. I tried to start a conversation, speaking gently about small matters, news from the neighborhood, the weather, nothing heavy. But he interrupted me, speaking louder, cutting across my words. His wife laughed quietly at his remarks, and I felt a small knot of discomfort in my chest. I continued speaking, trying to remain calm, but he only grew louder, dismissing what I said with smirks and half-laughs. The atmosphere became tense, as if every word was a provocation. I did not expect what came next. He began mocking me openly at the table, speaking to me in a way I had never heard him speak before. It was not just disrespect. It was deliberate humiliation. My heart tightened in my chest. I looked at my wife, hoping she would intervene, but she only glanced away. My son's tone grew sharper still. He leaned toward me, his voice filled with contempt, and said something that cut deeply. I kept my voice calm, trying to respond with patience, but he would not allow it. Then it happened. His mouth moved toward me, and before I could react, I felt warm wetness strike my cheek. I flinched, but the shock was only the beginning. He spat on my face again, and again, 15 times in total, each spitting followed by laughter from his wife. They were not just mocking me, they were celebrating my humiliation. The sound of laughter rang louder in my ears than any argument had before. The room felt cold. My dignity, the years of work and sacrifice I had given to build this family, seemed to shatter under that laughter. I did not speak. I did not raise my voice. I could feel my heart pounding, my pride crushed under humiliation. I lowered my head slightly and wiped my face quietly. My son sat back in his chair, smiling, as if he had proven some point. His wife clapped softly, as though this was entertainment rather than cruelty. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by their laughter and the faint sound of silverware set down sharply. I knew then that nothing I could say at that moment would change their mind. Respect had been replaced by mockery, and mockery had turned into cruelty. As I sat there, the warmth of anger rose inside me, but I held it back. I did not want to feed their satisfaction. Their laughter was fuel for me, but not in the way they thought. It became fuel for a decision, a plan, a quiet form of justice. I realized that this moment was more than an insult. It was a turning point. The cruelty was no longer something I could bear silently. My silence before had been patience, but this was deliberate, calculated disrespect. This was not a mistake. It was a choice my son made, and it demanded a response. After dinner, I went to my room without a word. I sat quietly, cleaning my face again, staring at myself in the mirror. The humiliation burned deeper than the coldness of his words. I thought about every year I had worked for him, working double shifts, giving up my own comfort, sacrificing my own health so he could have more. And now, at one table, in a moment of rage or arrogance, he spat on me 15 times, 15 strikes at my dignity, my life's work, and my fatherhood. It was not just disrespect, it was betrayal. That night, sleep would not come. I lay awake listening to the quiet of the house, replaying every detail of the dinner. His laughter, her laughter, the sound of my own silence. It all became a vivid memory I could not erase. I thought about what respect meant, about what it meant to be a father, and about what it meant to give without expectation. I thought about the walls I had built in that house, the roof I had paid for with my sweat and tears, the dinners I had prepared without complaint. And I realized that respect is not something given, it is something earned. I understood in that moment that I could not change what had been done to me with words alone. I could not undo humiliation by explaining myself. I had tried for years to teach respect through example, but he had chosen a different lesson, a lesson of cruelty. That meant I had to respond differently. My answer would not be shouting or anger. It would be something far quieter, something far deeper. It would be a lesson not in words, but in action, a lesson that he could never erase. By the time I lay down that night, I had decided. The spitting had not just wounded me, it had awakened something inside me. I would take control of what I could, and I would let the truth speak for itself. I would make my son understand without a single shout or a single scene. That night, I began to prepare. My mind was set. Respect would be reclaimed, not through argument, but through a choice that he would never see coming. I would let the act speak louder than any word, louder than any fight. louder than any humiliation. The next morning, I woke with resolve. I cleaned myself, dressed quietly, and went about my day as if nothing had happened. But inside, I was making a plan. The cruelty at dinner was a wound, but wounds heal. Respect, once lost, can be restored, but only if taught in the right way. I began quietly to consider my options, to seek out a way to reclaim what had been stolen, not property, but dignity. I knew the moment was coming when I would act, and I knew I would not be wrong in doing so. That night, I went to sleep with one thought in my mind. Silence had ended. The lesson had begun, and it would be a lesson remembered forever. After that night, I did not speak of what happened at the table. I kept my thoughts to myself, letting the silence sit heavy between us. I sat alone in my room long after everyone had gone to bed, staring at the dim light that filtered through the window. My face still felt the warmth of humiliation, and my pride still ached like an old wound. The sounds of the house were quiet, too quiet. But in that silence, my mind was alive, turning over the moment again and again. I could hear the laughter of my son and his wife echoing inside me. It was not just laughter, it was a sound that burned into memory. I thought about every meal I had made for them, every cold morning I had worked to make sure the house was warm. I thought about the years I had labored to give them comfort, the nights I had sacrificed my sleep for their needs, the weekends I had spent building the home they lived in. And yet, in one night, at one table, those years of sacrifice were spat upon. 15 times. 15 times. It became a number in my mind, a count that kept coming back, a mark of disrespect I could not erase. I realized that this was more than an insult. It was a wound that cut deep into my soul. I sat by the small lamp in my room and replayed my life in my mind. I remembered the early days when I had worked hard to build not just a home, but a life for my family. How I had given everything I had without asking for anything in return, believing love and respect would be the reward. I remembered the pride I had taken in my home, the way I had cared for it as if it were a living thing, as if every brick, every nail carried my own blood and sweat. Now, I could not help but see that all of it had been taken for granted. The memory of that dinner haunted me. It was not the argument that hurt. It was the way they treated me. Not just my son, but his wife as well. Her laughter still rang in my ears, sharp and cruel. The sound of mockery had a way of digging deeper than physical pain. I kept thinking, how had it come to this? How had the relationship between father and son fallen to this point? I had lived my life believing that respect was built quietly, through years of example, not shouted into existence. And yet, respect had been stripped away from me in the loudest, cruelest way possible. That night, I began to see clearly what silence could not hide. I realized that the respect I had hoped for could not be demanded in words. Words were not enough. Respect had to be shown, earned, and preserved through actions. My silence before had been patience, but patience without action had brought me to this table, humiliated, spat upon, ignored. I understood then that my silence must change. It must become something stronger. It must become a quiet form of justice that could not be denied. I thought about what I could do. I did not want to fight. I did not want a scene. I wanted something deeper, something that would teach a lesson without raising voices, something that would make my son understand without me having to speak a word. I thought about dignity. I thought about pride. I thought about how years of giving can be mistaken for weakness if boundaries are not held. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. My answer would not be anger. It would be action. For hours, I sat thinking quietly. I thought about the house, the home I had built with my own hands. I thought about ownership, not just legal, but moral. I thought about how I had given everything and how everything had been disregarded. The dinner was not just a moment. It was a turning point. It had stripped away the illusion that kindness and patience would always be respected. That night, I began to understand that respect must be earned in every moment, and that sometimes a man must defend it in ways that cannot be ignored. My thoughts wandered to the years ahead. I imagined a life where my silence would no longer be mistaken for weakness. I imagined teaching my son a lesson he could not forget, not through shouting or argument, but through a quiet act of truth. I saw myself taking control of what I could, of what was mine. I realized that the moment had passed for words. The moment had arrived for action, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. It was not the calm of surrender, it was the calm of resolution. I stayed up long into the night. I did not cry, and I did not shout. I sat quietly, reflecting. The humiliation had been deep, but it had also opened my eyes. It had shown me where patience ends and action must begin. It had shown me that respect is not something that can be commanded at the table. It is something that must be protected and defended. I realized that I could not remain silent any longer. Silence had been my shield, but it had also allowed disrespect to grow. It was time to put an end to it. Before sleep finally came, I made a decision. I would act. Not in anger, but in quiet certainty. I would reclaim what had been taken, not out of spite, but out of principle. The laughter, the spitting, the humiliation, all of it had shown me something important, that my voice alone was not enough. Respect required proof. Proof in the form of action. And I would give it. I would make sure that my answer would be remembered. When the first light of morning came, I rose quietly. I did not speak of my decision. I went about my day as if nothing had happened, but inside, my mind was set. I knew what I must do, and I knew the weight of what was coming. That night, I slept with the knowledge that my silence had ended. The lesson had begun. I would no longer allow disrespect to be thrown into my face without consequence. I would meet it with something stronger, something lasting, and so I waited. That morning, after long hours of thought and quiet reflection, I knew my next step had to be deliberate. It could not be rushed. My pride, my dignity, and my sense of justice all demanded that I act with patience and careful thought. I remembered every moment of humiliation from the night before, the laughter, the spit, the coldness in their voices. They thought it was weakness when I stayed silent. I knew now it was time to transform silence into something powerful, something they could not ignore. I began by thinking about what they had taken. Not just my dignity, but also a home, a sanctuary, a place where years of my labor and sacrifice had lived in every brick and nail. My son had treated that home without respect, and the worst part was, it had been built with his mother's and my sweat. I knew the house was mine by law and by right, but I needed to make my choice count in a way that could not be undone. I sat down with my papers and began to look over the ownership deeds. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the knowledge that what I was about to do would change everything. For years, I had been silent when my son disrespected me. I had told myself it was patience, it was love, it was family. But I saw clearly now that silence without action is permission. My silence had been mistaken for acceptance. That night had shown me I could no longer accept disrespect without consequence. I made my decision slowly, like one makes an important promise. I would not yell, and I would not shout. My response would be quiet, but absolute. I would sell his house. Not out of cruelty, but out of principle. This would be my statement to him, a statement of dignity, a statement of ownership, and a statement that disrespect carries consequences. It would not be a moment of anger, but a lesson built in silence and certainty. Before moving forward, I consulted my lawyer quietly. I did not want this to be a public spectacle, nor did I want to give them the chance to challenge me unnecessarily. My lawyer assured me that I had full legal rights. Everything was in my name, and there was no way for them to undo the sale once the papers were signed. This knowledge gave me a strange peace. I was not acting out of malice. I was acting within my rights and within the lessons I wanted to leave behind. The lawyer and I went over every detail. The deed, the ownership papers, the legal clauses, all of them pointed to the same truth. The house was mine, and I could choose to transfer it. It was not a decision I took lightly. I thought of the years I had spent building and protecting that home. I thought of every winter I had kept the fire burning, every day I had worked so my family could have shelter. But I also thought of that night, the night my own son spat in my face, laughed, and turned respect into cruelty. That memory was enough to steel my resolve. I knew the choice would hurt him deeply, and perhaps it should. He needed to understand that respect is not something to be thrown away like trash. Respect is earned, guarded, and defended. My choice was not revenge for the sake of pride. It was a lesson in respect. I would not confront him with words again. My action would speak louder than any argument. I knew this was the moment where my silence would transform into truth. That day, I began making arrangements quietly. I contacted a real estate agent I trusted and instructed him to find a buyer discreetly. I did not want rumors before the moment came. I wanted the act to speak without interference. I thought carefully about timing, when to act so the lesson would be most clear. It was not about hurting him, it was about teaching him something he had ignored for years. I began preparing my mind for what would come next. Selling a house is more than signing papers. It is a transfer of security, history, and trust. I thought of all the memories built inside those walls. But I also thought of the moment my son destroyed my dignity. I knew there could be no going back. My decision was firm. This would be my statement, my silent answer, my proof that boundaries matter and respect cannot be ignored. That evening, I wrote a letter. I kept it short, without anger. I wrote simply, "Respect must be earned and defended. You chose to disrespect me. I chose to answer in a way you cannot undo. The house is sold." I folded it neatly and placed it where he would find it. I did not add insults or anger. This was not a plea for reconciliation. It was a statement of principle. It was my way of closing a chapter without raising my voice. I slept that night with a calm that surprised me. I was not angry anymore. I was ready. I knew what I had to do, and I knew it was just. The quietness in my heart was different. It was not peace after defeat, but peace before action. I had spent years sacrificing and hoping for respect. That hope was gone now. What remained was certainty. My silence had ended, and my decision was ready. In the morning, I moved quietly. There was no shouting, no announcements, no drama. I met with my lawyer again, signed the papers, and transferred ownership of the house to the buyer. Every signature was deliberate. Every moment of the process was done with calm purpose. I did not want my son to see this as an act of revenge. I wanted him to see it as a statement of truth. I wanted him to remember that some lessons cannot be spoken. They must be lived. When the final document was signed, I felt a strange sense of closure. I was not taking revenge out of spite, but giving a lesson without words. The house was sold. The door was closed. And with it, my silence ended. I did not need to shout to make my point. My action would speak louder than any words ever could. This was my decision. This was my answer. This was my peace. That day, I carried the quiet weight of what I had done. I knew my son would feel the loss, not only of the house, but of the lesson hidden within it. I knew he would wake up one day to understand what had happened, and whether he understood it or not, I knew I had acted with dignity. My decision was not about winning, it was about teaching, and that was enough for me. The morning after my decision was made, I moved quietly, but with clear purpose. I knew this moment had to be handled with precision. There could be no mistakes, no last-minute hesitation. Selling the house was not just about property, it was about delivering the lesson I had chosen. I began by contacting my trusted real estate agent, someone who understood the need for discretion. I asked him to keep everything quiet until the final moment. This was not a spectacle. This was a statement, and statements should land with impact, not noise. We discussed the details of the sale carefully. I wanted a buyer who would respect the home, who would not turn the transaction into gossip. The agent agreed to keep everything confidential. There was no need for announcements, no need for explanations. The less they knew, the stronger the lesson would be. I told him simply, "I want this done quietly. I want this done with certainty." He nodded and began making arrangements. As I waited, I thought about the house itself. Every corner held years of my work and memory. I thought about the nights I had stayed up fixing a leak, the days I had carried loads of wood in winter, the mornings I had swept the steps before my family woke. That house had been more than walls. It was my gift, my shelter, my legacy. But it had become a stage for humiliation. My son had chosen disrespect over gratitude. I had no choice but to turn that stage into a lesson. I prepared myself for the day when the sale would be final. I knew my son would not understand immediately. He would feel shock, confusion, perhaps even rage. But that was not my concern. I was not acting out of anger, but out of principle. This was not a fight. It was a teaching moment. I wanted my son to see that disrespect carries a price. I wanted him to remember that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. The day the buyer was ready, I met with my lawyer and signed the papers. Each signature was deliberate. I read every line, understanding fully what I was giving away and what I was taking back. This was not impulsive. It was deliberate, calm, and final. There was no turning back. The ownership of my son's house had passed to another. I had made sure there was no loophole, no way for him to reverse it. This was my quiet victory. When everything was signed, I asked the agent to keep the matter private until the right moment. I wanted my son to discover it fully, not in whispers, but in truth. I prepared the letter I would leave for him, simple and without malice. I wrote, "Respect is not given, it is earned. You spat in my face. I have spoken without words. The house is sold. This is my answer." It was short, but every word was deliberate. I placed the letter where he would find it after the change was complete. The house sale was completed without fanfare. No dramatic announcements, no confrontations. I had chosen to let the act speak for itself. My lawyer assured me everything was clean, legal, and irreversible. That gave me peace. This was not a matter of revenge in the way people often think of it. It was a matter of justice. It was a matter of showing my son that cruelty cannot go unanswered, that silence can end with a strong answer. I thought about how this would unfold. I imagined the moment my son would come home and see the locks changed, the papers signed, and the letter left for him. I knew he would feel anger first, then confusion, and eventually he would understand. Perhaps not immediately, but one day. My silence had been replaced with action, and my action was now complete. That night, I did not boast or celebrate. I sat quietly in my own home, feeling the weight of what I had done. I knew the lesson was planted. Whether it would grow into understanding for my son was beyond my control. What mattered was that I had acted with dignity. I had not shouted, I had not fought, yet my message was clear. I had chosen a path that left no room for argument. The house was sold, and with it, a chapter of my life was closed. This was not an act of vengeance, it was an act of teaching. I had endured years of silence, hoping for respect. But respect never came. What came was humiliation, cruelty, and the loss of my dignity. Now, I had given my answer, not in anger, but in the certainty of my choice. The sale of the house was my statement. Respect cannot be taken lightly, and respect cannot be taken without consequence. As I lay down to rest that night, I felt something I had not felt in years. Peace. I had taken the wound, the humiliation, and turned it into a lesson they could not erase. My silence had ended, replaced by a quiet act of justice. I had sold the house, not to punish, but to speak the truth. And in that truth, I found my own dignity restored. The day came when I knew my son would discover what I had done. I had arranged everything quietly, without noise or warning. I let the day pass as usual, though inside I knew it would not be usual for long. I sat in my chair sipping tea, watching the world go by, while a quiet satisfaction grew in my chest. There was no rush. I knew that when the moment arrived, it would speak louder than any argument I could make. Later that afternoon, I saw him returning. I had not gone to meet him. I stayed in my place, letting the silence grow heavy. I heard the sound of his footsteps in the yard, quick and impatient. Then the sound of the front gate, rattling. He was trying the door. His voice rose with confusion and surprise as he called my name. But I remained quiet, knowing that the truth would come to him without my interference. He tried the key, then another. His face changed with each attempt, first confusion, then anger, then disbelief. He banged on the door, shouting my name louder now. Neighbors began to glance over, curious. I stayed inside, listening, letting the sound of his frustration build. It was a sound he had earned. 15 times he spat in my face. This was the moment the lesson would find its mark. Finally, he gave up the noise and looked around. His eyes found something on the table inside, the letter I had left. He came closer, reading it with shaking hands. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every year I had given him. Respect is not given, it is earned. You spat in my face. I have spoken without words. The house is sold. This is my answer. He read the letter again and again, as if trying to understand how it had happened. His confusion turned to disbelief. He knocked at the door again, harder this time, but the locks would not budge. He pulled at the handle, shouted my name, called for me to open the door, but there was only silence in reply. I stayed inside quietly. I had no need to add to the moment. My action was speaking louder than any argument could. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about what had happened. Someone had seen him shouting, knocking, and finally stepping away in defeat. The story spread that the house, the one he had taken for granted, was now gone. The man who had endured spitting and mockery had turned his silence into action. That action was the revelation. It was the truth laid bare. My son's face showed a mixture of anger and shame. I could see it even without looking directly at him. His wife stood beside him, silent now, her laughter from the earlier dinners replaced by a quiet unease. For a moment, they both seemed to understand what had happened. It was not about the house alone. It was about respect, about the way we treat the people who give us life. Later that evening, the whispers reached me. Friends, neighbors, even strangers spoke quietly of the lesson. Some called it justice. Others called it revenge. I called it truth. The house was gone, but what remained was the answer to years of silence. My son had learned without me raising my voice. He had learned that cruelty carries a price, that respect must be mutual, or it will be taken away. In my quiet home that night, I thought about the path I had chosen. I had not shouted. I had not fought in the way he had expected. I had chosen a different road. I had chosen to speak with action, not words. And the revelation was complete. The locks, the papers, the letter, they were all part of my message. They were my way of telling him, your cruelty will not be forgotten, and it will not go unanswered. I knew he would think of that day for the rest of his life. Whether he admitted it or not, he would remember. The moment he found the letter, the locked door, the empty silence, those would be his reminders. I had given him something far greater than any argument, a truth so clear that it needed no explanation. That night, I did not celebrate with noise or pride. I sat quietly, reflecting on what had happened. I thought of the years of sacrifice, of the dinners shared, of the moments of laughter now gone. And I knew that the revelation was not about the house. It was about the lesson my silence had spoken. The house was gone. My son had his answer, and I had kept my peace. The morning after the revelation was quiet, but heavy. The neighbors spoke softly in hushed tones, looking at each other with a mixture of curiosity and respect. The news of what had happened spread quickly. My son's humiliation was no longer hidden. He could no longer claim ignorance. That locked door and the letter had become proof of something far deeper, an answer to years of disrespect. I watched the whispers pass by my window as I sat quietly, sipping tea, knowing the lesson was now out in the open. My son's face was pale when I stepped outside. His voice was low, and he spoke fewer words than before. He asked questions about the house, the sale, the papers, but I gave no answers. Silence had been my weapon. He had learned that words were not enough, that truth often comes quietly, without ceremony. He could not undo what was done. The house was gone. My action had been final, and the weight of it pressed on him. I saw him walking through the street later that day, speaking to neighbors in low tones. His face showed a mix of anger, shame, and regret. People noticed. Some shook their heads. Others kept their distance. I understood then that this was the real fallout. The lesson had reached beyond our family. It was now a story shared quietly in the neighborhood, a quiet warning that respect is not a thing to be taken for granted. His wife no longer laughed at the table. She avoided meeting my eyes when we crossed paths. That laughter, which had once mocked me so cruelly, had been replaced by silence. She knew the truth of what had happened. She knew that my decision had been deliberate, a careful answer to a cruelty she had watched unfold. There was no joy in her silence, only an understanding that I had spoken in a way neither she nor my son could deny. The fallout was not just in words or looks, it was in actions. My son stopped coming to our gatherings. He stopped calling. He stopped speaking to me entirely. I did not seek reconciliation. I did not call him. I let the silence deepen, knowing that the lesson would remain without further words. He had tested me. He had spat on me 15 times in front of witnesses. My silence had been broken not by argument, but by action, and that action was permanent. Neighbors began to treat me differently. Some came quietly to my door, offering their respect. Others avoided me, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of discomfort. I did not mind. My life was no longer about approval from those who had hurt me. It was about my own peace, about knowing I had acted in truth. The fallout had changed the relationship entirely, not only between my son and me, but in the way our family was now spoken of in the community. In the days that followed, I noticed how my son carried himself. There was no pride left in his step. His arrogance had been replaced by silence and careful thought. I could see the change in him when he thought no one was watching. Perhaps he began to understand what I had done, not as an act of vengeance, but as a lesson. That lesson was not about a house, but about respect. And respect, once lost, cannot simply be demanded. It must be earned. The fallout extended beyond my own home. At family gatherings, conversations shifted. Relatives no longer spoke with casual disregard. They spoke quietly of the day the house was sold, of the locked door, of the letter left behind. The lesson had grown beyond the walls of my family. It had become a story, a quiet testament to what happens when cruelty meets resolve. My son had lost more than a house that day. He had lost his place in my home and, perhaps, his claim to respect. For me, the fallout brought peace. I had not needed to shout. I had not needed to fight. My silence and the action I had taken spoke for me. I knew the lesson was learned, even if it would take years for him to admit it. I carried no hatred, no bitterness. Only the quiet satisfaction that I had answered cruelty in a way he could not ignore, a way that could not be undone. That night, I sat alone by the window. The house was quiet. The wind moved softly outside. I thought about what had happened. The locked door, the letter, the sale. All of it was more than a reaction. It was a statement. And in that quiet evening, I felt the full weight of the fallout. It was not just my son who would remember it. The whole family would. The whole neighborhood would. And I was content knowing that the truth had been spoken without shouting. In the silence of my home that night, I understood the depth of what I had done. It was not just about a house or a locked door. It was about the lesson that cruelty has a cost, that disrespect cannot be brushed aside, that actions can speak louder than words. And in that understanding, the fallout had been complete. My son would never see me the same way again, and perhaps that was the real answer I had been seeking all along. After the storm of that night and the long silence that followed, I found peace in ways I had not expected. I did not shout. I did not demand apologies. I walked away quietly, carrying with me only the knowledge that I had acted in truth. My revenge had been deliberate, calm, and final. I sold the house not out of anger, but out of a need to teach a lesson that words could never deliver. That lesson was complete, and in it lay my peace. I no longer needed to prove anything to my son. The truth of that night had spoken louder than any confrontation ever could. The mornings that followed felt lighter to me. I woke without dread. I walked without the tension that had clung to my shoulders for years. My home was smaller now, but my heart felt fuller. There was no bitterness, no lingering anger. Only the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had answered cruelty with something deeper, a lesson that could not be ignored. My son had tested me, spat upon my dignity, and I had answered not with noise, but with a final act that could not be undone. I moved slowly into a new rhythm of life. The neighbors still whispered, but I paid them no mind. I kept to myself, tending my garden, sitting quietly with my memories, and letting the days pass in calm reflection. That peace was not built on forgiveness for cruelty. It was built on the certainty that I had done what was right for myself. The house I had sold was gone, but something heavier had been lifted from my shoulders. I felt free in a way I had not for decades. There was no reconciliation. I did not seek my son. He did not come to me. But I no longer needed his presence to feel whole. My peace came from knowing I had protected myself, my dignity, and my values. I had shown that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. I had acted when silence was no longer enough, and in doing so, I found something more valuable than any house: my quiet dignity. At times I thought of him. I wondered if he understood. I wondered if he reflected on that night and the quiet sale that followed. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he carried that lesson quietly within him, as I now carried mine. I never wished him harm, only for him to understand that cruelty has a cost. My peace was not in revenge. It was in the quiet justice of letting truth be final. And in that truth, I found my freedom. I began to live differently. I no longer sought to prove my worth to those who had shown disrespect. I no longer tried to command respect where it was absent. My peace came in acceptance. I accepted what had happened, not as defeat, but as the final step in a lesson I had chosen to give. That lesson was not for me. It was for them, for my son, and perhaps for anyone who ever thought they could diminish another without consequence. The house was gone, but its absence did not haunt me. The wound had healed, and in its place was a quiet calm. I walked with my head held high, knowing I had answered wrong with right. I had chosen a path that left no room for endless argument, only for the undeniable truth of what had been done. And in that truth, I found peace that no cruelty could undo. I began to enjoy my days. I read more. I tended my garden with care. I spoke with neighbors who came quietly to my door, offering words of respect. They understood what had happened, even if my son did not. That understanding became part of my peace. I no longer measured my life by the approval of my family, but by the quiet strength of knowing I had stood for my dignity. That peace was not loud. It was not filled with proclamations or public declarations. It was quiet, steadfast, and personal. It lived in my daily life, in my slow steps, and in my quiet smile when I thought of that night. My son had spat on my face 15 times. I had answered 15 days later, not with anger, but with the calm certainty that comes from knowing you have done right. In that peace, I found closure. The bitterness had gone. The humiliation had turned into strength. My revenge had been complete, not in destruction, but in a quiet, final act of truth. And in that act, I found something far greater than a house. I found peace for my soul. Now, as an old man, I tell this story quietly. I tell it not to boast or to seek sympathy, but to share a lesson I have learned deeply. Respect cannot be demanded. It cannot be shouted into existence. It is earned quietly through actions, patience, and truth. My son spat on my face 15 times to prove power over me. I sold his house to prove a greater truth, that dignity cannot be taken without cost. That truth is the peace I carry with me now. I look back on that dinner table often. The laughter, the cruelty, the locked doors, the silence afterward. It is all a part of the lesson I learned and gave. I understand now that silence is powerful, but action is stronger. Words fade, acts remain. My acts spoke louder than years of argument. It gave me peace and taught my son a lesson he could never forget. The lesson was not in revenge, but in the certainty of truth. I did not sell his house out of hate. I sold it to make him understand that cruelty comes with a cost, that respect is not given freely when it is trampled upon, that dignity is not something to be taken lightly. My action was quiet, lawful, and final, a demonstration that actions speak louder than words. I have lived many years since that day. My son never forgave me, and perhaps he never will. But I do not carry bitterness for it. I have learned that forgiveness is not always necessary when peace has been found. I have forgiven myself for what I did because I did it for my own dignity. I have accepted that my son's path is his own, shaped by the choices he makes. My life now is quieter. I tend to my garden. I walk slowly in the mornings. I sit by my window and watch the seasons change. I tell this story not for applause, but so others might understand what I learned, that cruelty must be answered with truth and respect must be earned through action. My son's lesson became mine as well. I learned that peace comes when you stand firm in truth, without shouting, without rage, without bitterness. If I could speak to him now, I would say this: I did not sell your house to destroy you. I sold it to remind you that respect is priceless. I chose a quiet path because I believe that dignity is won in silence and action, not in noise and anger. My peace came when I let go of the need to prove myself and instead proved my truth. Now, when I sit quietly in my home, I think of that night and the days that followed. I feel no regret. The lesson was hard, but it was necessary. My son spat on my face 15 times to prove a point. I sold his house 15 days later to prove a greater one. That respect is not optional, and dignity is not disposable. My final thought is simple. Cruelty leaves a mark, but so does quiet justice. I found my peace not in confrontation, but in certainty. I found closure not in anger, but in action. And I learned that the strongest answer to betrayal is not vengeance. It is truth. He spat on my face 15 times. I sold his house 15 days later, and in that I found my peace.